Hello, my name is Barbara Cullinane and I'm Ireland's Deputy Permanent Representative to the EU here in Brussels. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you and to thank you for joining us for this St. Brigid's Day webinar. As many of you will know, St. Brigid is one of Ireland's 3 patron saints, and St. Brigid's Day traditionally marks the beginning of spring in Ireland, although it doesn't look particularly like spring today in Brussels, I have to say. Since 2018, Irish diplomatic missions have marked St. Brigid's Day by highlighting the talent, creativity and contribution of women who have shaped both Ireland and the world. And this year marks 50 years since Ireland signed the Treaty of Accession to the EU. The Government of Ireland is undertaking a programme of events to mark this important anniversary, and we deeply value our membership of the EU and the benefits that Ireland has gained from it. But we are also very proud of the contribution that Ireland and the Irish people have made to the EU. And so this St. Brigid's Day is an opportunity to honour and to celebrate the Irish women who have led and continue to lead the EU. We are very privileged to be joined by 3 Irish women who are true trailblazers. Between them, they hold a number of firsts. They are the first women to hold a range of important and influential EU and Irish posts, from representing Ireland in the Council to leading the European Commission and holding European institutions to account. They have each shaped the EU. We are joined by Anne Anderson. Anne was Ireland's permanent representative to the EU during Ireland's presidency of the Council in 2004. She was the first woman from any EU member state to hold the role of permanent representative. Catherine Day is a former Secretary General of the European Commission. She was the first woman to hold this post from 2005 to 2015. And throughout her career, Catherine has played a major role in a number of key EU policy areas. Emily O'Reilly is the European Ombudsman and was first elected to the role in 2013. She is also the first woman to hold this post. And previously, Emily was the first female Ombudsman and Information Commissioner in Ireland. So I'm delighted that we are joined by such a distinguished panel today, and I'm sure our audience will join me in extending a warm virtual welcome to our speakers. So I will be engaging with our speakers for about half an hour before we open the floor to virtual questions. Our online audience can ask questions through the Sli.do platform by going to the webpage Sli.do, so Sli.do, and using the code #BrigidEU. That's #BRIGIDEU to access the system. You don't have to register, anyone can do it. And so with that, I'm eager to hear from our panelists. And so to begin with, I'd like to ask each of you, is there one achievement from your time working in the EU that you would like to highlight? Maybe Catherine, we might go to you first.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and a very happy St. Brigid's Day to everybody who's joined us. For me, the standout part of my career has to be enlargement to the East. I still remember in the summer of 1989, waking up every day to hear stories about the East Germans camped in the West German embassy in Hungary, and that feeling that history was changing, and that when the Berlin Wall came down later that year, you really had that feeling of something momentous was happening. And it was a big team effort. But now it seems like a foregone conclusion, but at that time it was anything but obvious that all these countries would make the grade, so to speak, and be able to join the EU. And at the same time, it felt so important that they had the chance to do so and to choose their own, the way they wanted to live their own lives. And most of those countries were small, and I do think the EU is a particularly positive union for small countries to be in. So that was for me a fantastic experience, and one that I will always be very proud of. Of course, I'm pretty disappointed now at what's happening in Hungary and Poland at the moment, but I still remain, resolutely optimistic that in the longer term they will adhere to the values that they wanted so badly and worked so hard to be part of when they joined.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Anne, would you like to share any achievements that you'd particularly like to highlight?
Thanks, Barbara, and great to join you on St. Brigid's Day. Well, you mentioned in your introduction there the Irish presidency of the European Union. in 2004. And I really would like to single that out. A presidency, of course, it's always a big deal, but pre-Lisbon Treaty, the responsibilities were even greater than they now are. And of course, a presidency, it's always a big team effort involving hordes of people, but as Perm Rep, you do have a pivotal role in planning and keeping the show on the road. And that really was a very, very consequential period. Catherine has talked about enlargement, when we welcomed in and bedded down the 10 new member states. We agreed the constitutional treaty, which later became the basis for the Lisbon Treaty. We also navigated delicate negotiations for the new president of the European Commission. So, as I said, a very consequential time, an enormous amount of planning, lots of people involved, of course. But I think we were very proud to do it for Irish diplomacy. It was really seen as a model presidency. But even more than that, it was a time when there was a lot of discussion about the respective roles and contributions of small and large member states. And we really felt in doing it, we were showcasing Irish diplomacy, but we were also showcasing how a small member state can make an outsized contribution to the running of the Union. So that's something, yes, in which I'm very proud to have been part of.
Thanks, Anne. And of course, as small member states managing presidencies, that continues in a different way, as you say, but it continues as a challenge now. Emily, would you like to talk about an achievement that you would like to highlight?
Well, first of all, hi, Barbara, and happy St. Brigid's Day to everybody. I am suffering a little bit from imposter syndrome here when I've listened to Catherine and Anne talking about the huge geopolitical issues that they were involved in and ran so well. I remember I just become Irish Ombudsman when Anne took up the reins of leading the Irish presidency to the EU in 2004. And I remember, even though I didn't know you, I remember so many people complimenting you and the work that you had done. You did a brilliant job. And Catherine I met very shortly after I became European Ombudsman. And obviously, given that our biggest client has been the Commission, we did have a lot of but very good collaboration between us. So we are a tiny office. The Commission numbers, I think, 30,000 people. We have 70. We are the smallest agency office in the entire EU administration. But that doesn't mean that we don't lack ambition. I often describe my office as a small office with a big mandate, because we are the watchdog of the entire EU administration. And I suppose when I reflect on what I've done and what I wanted to do, what I wanted to achieve was to make my tiny office a lot more relevant, a lot more useful to the EU administration. I think we have achieved that. And I think where our work is particularly important and critical is in the area of democratic legitimacy, ensuring that what the EU administration does is seen as legitimate within the eyes of the citizen. And to that end, we've worked an awful lot on transparency, opening up the workings of the Council, of the Commission, and so on, worked in areas of ethics, integrity, and all of that. And we've expanded, because our visibility has become, a lot stronger over the last number of years. More people are coming to us with issues of significant public interest and that we are using our resources to deal with. So they can range from anything from trade agreements to Frontex, fundamental rights, all sorts of issues that we can play a small role. I see fundamentally what my office tries to do, and what I myself see is doing, is trying to keep the good guys good. I do see the EU as a force for good in the world, and given when so much is contested and challenged, and when there's so many difficulties and challenges facing all of us at EU level and globally, I think the EU has a moral obligation to be the best that it can be, and to the extent that we can help in that, we have done so and will continue to do so.
Thanks, Emily. I think it's fascinating listening to the three of you and seeing the breadth and the scale of the impact that Ireland and Irish people have had on so many significant issues. I think it would be interesting to reflect on your careers in leadership roles in the EU. And maybe, Anne, if I could ask you first, what was your initial experience of working as a woman in the EU institutions, and how has that changed?
Well, Barbara, my experience, I think, was fairly unique. Again, in your introduction, I think you mentioned my role as the first woman permanent representative. Certainly when I was appointed in 2001 and I was coming to Brussels, I was well aware that I was the first Irish woman to be Irish permanent representative. But I had absolutely no idea until I arrived in Brussels that I was the first woman permanent representative from any member state in what was then an almost 45-year history of the European Union. And one newspaper put it, she made history by sitting down, which, you know, is an easy enough way to make history. But it was certainly interesting walking into that room with 14, we were then 15 member states, 14 men at the inner table. And then with enlargement in 2004, I thought I might have some reinforcement, but 10 men walked in to represent the 10 new member states. So in the presidency I spoke about, I was presiding over a COREPER, Committee of Permanent Representatives of 24 men and myself. So it was interesting. I have to say, I didn't experience any sort of overt discrimination. There was no patronizing, no condescension, no concessions made, nor would I have wanted anybody. It was a equal treatment. But, and there is an interesting but here, I often reflected on the atmospherics of COREPER at the time. It was quite testosterone fueled, I would say. There were a lot of big egos, a certain amount of verbal strutting and locking of horns, very late night work was taken as for granted. And I often did reflect if the atmosphere might have been somewhat different had there been a better gender balance, not so much the atmosphere as the working mode might have been different with a better gender balance. Luxembourg appointed a woman just towards the end of my time. I gather now that there are 7 women permanent representatives, what, about 25%. I'd love to be a fly on the wall and see if things have changed in terms of the atmospherics of COREPER. I mean, I think I want to hear from the others, so I leave it largely at that. But I would say the European Council at my time, and as Perm Rep, of course, I was there, it was pre-Angela Merkel, and I'm sure her presence made an extraordinary difference. But my time, it was Chirac and Schroeder and Berlusconi, and I think enough said on that subject.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry, Emily, could I put the same question to you about your initial experiences working in the EU as a woman and what changes you've seen?
Well, I suppose, as you say, I have a number of firsts as a woman. I was the first female political correspondent of a national newspaper, daily newspaper in Ireland. I was the first female Irish ombudsman. I was the first female European ombudsman, but I never went on. I never started any of those jobs sort of thinking that was a huge badge that I was wearing. I mean, as far as I was concerned, I was, appointed, selected, recruited because, I was the best candidate and that was it. But that doesn't mean that I didn't notice, the men around me or the male power plays or anything like that. I certainly did. And I was just reflecting on what Anne said. I think women in the room do make a difference. I mean, my experience of women working with them is that in general, I'm speaking generally, women get on with the job. And men tend to get on with the job as well, but sometimes their egos do get a little bit in the way and they're more into the stuff of it, the status around it and all of that. I'm not saying that we're not into status as well, but so when I was Irish Ombudsman, when I became Irish Ombudsman, virtually all of the senior people in my office were men, including the Director General. Subsequently, a woman was appointed as Director General. We were sort of together, working together for the final 18 months of my time as Irish Ombudsman, and we accomplished a huge amount. Similarly, when I became European Ombudsman, the entire senior management structure and middle management structure was male. There had been a male ombudsman. There was the Secretary General was the male. The 2 directors were male. 7 of the 8 heads of unit were male. There was 1 female head of unit. Within a few years, I reversed all of that. Now, possibly I've gone too far the other way. My Secretary General is a woman. My 2 directors are women. My head of unit, 2 of my heads of unit are women. So, people might say that the gender balance has gone a bit awry, but as one of my colleagues said to me, Emily, I don't think that men are in need of positive discrimination yet. So that is something that I hang on to. And I do reflect on, why it is I have chosen women. I don't think I ever went in with the intention of choosing a woman. I always went in with the intention of choosing the best person, but also the person I was most likely to work best with, because when two people at the top work together, as these other women know, then everything works so much better. So that's one reflection. When I became European Ombudsman, yes, I met a lot of the big boys at the time in the big positions. Van Rompuy, I think, who was the president of the council, but also who was head of the commission, and Schulz, who was head of the parliament. And let me put it this way, those gentlemen did not lack confidence. So that was interesting. And of course, there was quite a gap between them and me in terms of knowledge and position and so on. But anyway, I caught up fairly quickly. In fact, the man who I met that most impressed me in terms of not feeling that he had to people pander to his ego was actually Mario Draghi. He was somebody that I met. He was head of the ECB at the time. And he struck me as somebody who was, as the French say, bien dans sa peau, very confident in his own self, his own power, his own capacities, and didn't need to show it off. And I think his subsequent career has shown that. So those are my reflections.
Thanks very much, Emily. And maybe, Catherine, I can turn to you now. I saw you nodding and smiling at some of Anne's comments on her experiences. So maybe you'd like to share with us. Thank you.
Yes, well, for my first 20 years working in the Commission, there was no female commissioner. And there was one woman Director General in charge of the interpretation service. So there were no role models at the top, let's say. And I recognize very much Anne's description of the testosterone-fueled meetings. At that stage, they smoked cigars during the Commission meeting. So it sounds like a prehistoric era at this stage. But like Emily and Anne, I was very lucky in my career that I had the commissioners I worked for gave me lots of scope. They probably had more confidence in me than I had in myself. And I think, in a way, the lack of female role models and also coming from a small country meant that if you wanted to get things done or to have some influence, then you really had to, push against the system and show that you were as able as anybody else. And I think over time, that probably did give me an extra push to want to, work in different parts of the Commission and have some impact. So, and it's a completely different place now. I mean, now we have not yet gender balance, but we have another first woman president of the Commission. You have quite a good representation of women at top level and all the way through the ranks, and a very strong affirmative action program, because I think people have realized that you can't afford to ignore talent, and that if you have a deficit, you need to take action to correct it. In my time, people were more worried about geographic imbalance, as countries always want to be well represented in the different institutions, and particularly in my case in the Commission. But over time, the gender imbalance was also coming to the fore. And now I think the Commission is very actively working on that, not only in its social policy, but also for itself, to try on and bring on the best possible talent.
Thanks very much, Catherine. I think it's kind of come up in a way in what all of you have been talking about, but we often hear calls for men to play a more active role in challenging the gender status quo in workplaces. And I'm wondering, would you agree with that? And are there any particular positive examples that you could point to where men took that initiative during your career? I know, Emily, you mentioned being impressed by Mario Draghi, but are there other examples of men taking a specific role in challenging gender norms in the workplace?
Not that I can remember, to be perfectly frank. Yeah, they certainly employed women, but I'm not sure that there was ever anywhere I worked in where the male boss was sort of desperate to have gender balance or to work towards that. It just happened over time. More women came into the workplace, and very often as a result of changes that were brought in by the EU throughout the 70s and 80s and onwards, and not necessarily because of anything that was happening in Ireland or within the particular workplaces that I was in. I mean, I did find, I mean, you know, Anne and Catherine are quite exceptional women. I sometimes say that, you know, women who are mediocre should have the same rights as men have had in the past to rise through the ranks. We shouldn't need to be complete geniuses to do that. So no, I haven't. I mean, I think where change has happened in the workplace, it's actually come about because I've been the boss. I don't mean to sound egotistical, having blamed some men for being that way, but you know, it is the case. As I said, when I became Irish Ombudsman and then subsequently European Ombudsman, the whole nature of both offices, the look and nature of both offices changed radically, and that was not because there was a man anywhere who was decreeing that this should be done.
Thanks, Emily. Catherine, could I put the same question to you?
Mm-hmm. I think I can give you two examples. One was a British Director General back in the 1990s, who was the first. The Commission has a habit of working very long hours. It starts early in the morning like the north of Europe, and it works till late in the evening like the south of Europe. So it's the best or the worst of all worlds, depending on how you look at it. And this British Director General was the first in the Commission Civil Service to bring in a rule of no meetings starting before a certain time in the morning and no meetings after a certain time in the afternoon, in order to avoid the situation where mostly women had to say, I can't make it, I have to pick up kids. And that has become very commonplace now, but it was quite revolutionary in its time. My second example is actually when Barroso became president. He set himself the target that he wanted 1/3 women commissioners. And he really had to twist prime ministerial arms to get them. And in the end, the way that he did it was to offer big jobs to countries who would nominate a woman. And funnily enough, that worked. So he got his 1/3, but his successor, President Juncker, had to threaten that he would resign because he wasn't going to get the same 1/3 female makeup of his commission. So I think the examples show, yes, there are individual men who are prepared to put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. But secondly, it's not a battle that is fully yet won. Equality is still not, you know, the norm. You still have to argue for it and be determined.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And could I ask you, from your experience, of any particular positive examples that you may have identified?
Well, yes, I did throughout my career. I did encounter some men in the department in particular who would have seen themselves as gender conscious and gender champions. And I think Noel Dore, as Secretary General, a former Secretary General, would be in that category. Eamon Gilmore, as a former minister. And I know that today there are a lot of men in the department who would see themselves as gender champions. But having said that, I really do have to say that throughout my career, whether I was in Dublin or in Brussels or in New York or Geneva at the UN, time and time again, when there were issues on the table for negotiation that had a gender dimension or potentially had a gender dimension, time and again, it was left to the women around the table to bring up that issue, to put it on the table, to get it discussed. And I grew very tired of that, because if women's rights, as we say, truly are human rights, then they're everybody's concern. There should be equally a concern of the men. And shouldn't be something heroic or exceptional for a man to get involved in a gender discussion and to become a gender champion. It should be routine, consistent, day-to-day behavior by men. And certainly I did not find that to be the case throughout my career.
That kind of leads me on to another question, and it's something you touched on as well, Emily, in your last answer, and it's about supporting how women support women in their professional lives. And I'm just wondering, do you think and indeed how men support women, but do you think a different approach is needed compared to supporting male colleagues? Could I put that question maybe to Catherine first?
Yes, I do think a different approach is needed. I think it's still necessary to try and build the confidence of women. I mean, it's a truism nowadays to say, you know, if you publish a job with 7 attributes, men will apply if they fill 2 of the criteria, women won't apply unless they fulfill all of them. And I think it is the lack of confidence still that we have to overcome. And in my own department in the Commission, we had a special program to encourage and mentor women to go for senior positions. And I think it was the fact that the hierarchy kind of, you know, touched them on the shoulder and said, you should go for this, you've got everything that it takes, and that they were encouraged to do it, did lead to a lot of confidence. And so I think the tone from the top is very important. And that's why I think a clear message from the senior hierarchy that they think the job will best be done by a much better balanced gender mix is very important. And then I think in every day, you have to look at, is the working world really adapted to the needs of women and men? And I think women have, especially women with children, their time is counted, every second counts, juggling all the different responsibilities. And I think you do have to think about how do we work now? We've just been through a pandemic that has brought us all to remote working, and we have to work out how that's going to be in the future. But as a generalism, women don't have very much time to do the kind of networking that men do to advance their careers. And I do think, you know, finding different ways to encourage women to go for jobs, to give it a try, not to be put off if at first time they don't succeed. I do think that's very important. I think it's a responsibility of women who, you know, climb the ladder, but also of the men at the top. And I do think, you know, more and more of them are getting that. They see the benefits, and at least I hope they do.
Thanks, Catherine. And what would your view on that be? I mean, do you think a different approach is needed also in supporting female colleagues to develop their careers compared to supporting male colleagues? Or your experience of that?
Yeah, I think Catherine has put it very well, and I would very much agree with her. I do think, and of course we're speaking in generalizations here, but I do think in general that a differentiated approach is required. And for exactly the reasons that Catherine has outlined, and these are well-documented issues about women's confidence, the ambivalence that women have, that they are taught to have, the ambivalence about ambition. And Emily jokingly referred there at the outset to the imposter syndrome. It doesn't apply in her case, clearly, but I mean, it is well documented, and I have encountered it. And again, there are the societal issues, the fact that still that the domestic and the childcare responsibilities still fall disproportionately on women. And so that means that women are left juggling. Women are prone to feeling guilt. We have all, I imagine, felt it at some stage. So you have to take all these factors into account, and they do lead to the logic and the requirement for a differentiated approach. And again, as Catherine says, I think if you're a woman in a leadership position, you do have kind of a dual mandate. I've always seen myself as being an ambassador for Ireland, but also being, to a degree, a kind of a gender ambassador, whether it was, you know, speaking out and trying to distill from your own something from your own experience that might be helpful, or creating networks. I was involved in creating networks for women diplomats, both in Geneva and New York. And of course, trying to be accessible and available within your own embassy or your own structure. So, of course, harking back to our earlier question, men need to be involved, but I do think that we women who are privileged to be in the roles we have or have had, we do have a responsibility.
Thanks very much, Anne. Emily, would you like to come in on this one?
Yeah, well, I fully agree with everything that Catherine and Anne says. I mean, it surprises me now. There are an awful lot of young, brilliant women in my office, and I'm still surprised at the lack of confidence that there is amongst some of them, you know, given that we're talking about you know, ancient times almost, but we're in the 21st century now, and yeah, it still surprises me that young women can still lack that confidence given everything that has happened and given the education that they have. So I do see part of my role as being that mentor and encouraging them. And I think the fact that I have promoted many women to senior positions and take a keen interest when the trainees come in every year, and making sure that the women have the same opportunities as well. But I think one thing that I think the pandemic highlighted, and Catherine mentioned it, I think it really showed in very starkly that the burden of childcare and all of that still falls disproportionately on women in general. And we all read a lot about, you know, the particular struggles that women, and I know, as Anne said, we're talking very generally here, had in trying to do the day job and balancing that with, you know, the children who were at home and all of that. And during the hardest part of the pandemic, during lockdown, I made a point of ringing colleagues, kind of randomly, see how they were getting on, not about their work, but about, you know, their home situation. And I think I because I have, you know, 5 children, and we'd come out the other end by the time the pandemic arrived. Our youngest was 20, so I did not have those childcare issues, but I certainly understood them, and my heart went out to the women in particular who had small children, or even worse, teenagers at home, trying to manage all of that physically, emotionally, and so on, even though within the European Public Services, Catherine and Anne will acknowledge, you know, their excellent supports and all of that. So I think that, you know, my own personal experience and being a woman gave me a particular understanding of those challenges, and I could talk to them about how I had overcome them, or at least give them encouragement to go and take the next steps in their career, because many of them are really, really brilliant and outstanding young women.
Thanks very much, Emily. I'm conscious about opening it to the floor because we do have a number of questions coming in. But before we do that, if I could just abuse my position as the moderator here to put one last question to the three of you, and that's maybe for Anne and Catherine in particular, looking back on your time in your leadership roles. Is there anything else you would like to have done or achieved? And then maybe, Emily, I'll put a slightly different one to you. Anne, would you like to go first?
Right, Barbara. Well, I'm not going to talk about big policy issues for Ireland or the Europe, more directly something that I would have liked to have achieved when I was in Brussels. And I'm going to try not to do the quintessential female thing about beating yourself up here for the things you left undone. But it was an interesting experience for me. At the beginning of the pandemic, when I had a bit of free time, I put together a book of speeches that I had given throughout my career. And what struck me was the almost total dearth of speeches from my Brussels years, in contrast to every other assignment that I'd had. And I mean, I understand why, because I had my head down in Coreper all the time. And obviously, as a civil servant, you have to have a bit of sensitivity about what you're saying in public. But nevertheless, I really do think, given the communications gap that exists in Europe generally, given the misunderstandings and the bad rap that EU bureaucrats get, that I should have actually prioritized more this communication challenge and the importance of connecting with the public, trying to demystify the European Union, explaining in accessible terms what you're at and what you're hoping to achieve on a day-to-day basis. So that is my regret from the Brussels years, that I didn't, in being so engrossed in the day job, that I didn't take more time to do that important work of communication.
Thanks, Anne. That's very interesting. Catherine, would you like to jump in there?
Yes, I'm going to take the opposite line from Anne, because I'm going to mention a big thing. I think the saddest thing for me in all my time working in the EU, even though I had left by the time it actually happened, was Brexit. I think by the time the vote actually happened, it was inevitable. But having watched it build up slowly over the years, my regret is that all of us, that we didn't do more to try to convince the British people, particularly the English people, that the EU takes nothing away from its members, that it's a plus, that you can have everything that you hold dear, but for even medium-sized countries in the modern world, you need to belong to something bigger. And I think, looking back, we were too respectful of the fact that successive British governments didn't want EU officials, EU dignitaries, etc., visiting, making the point. And I hope that we have learned that lesson now for the future. I think Brexit itself has had many negative effects, but it has had a galvanizing effect on all the other member states to realize what you could lose if you were so foolish as to think that you should leave. And I hope that we can get much better at involving citizens. I last year was chairing the Irish Citizens Assembly on gender equality, and the way Ireland has dealt with very difficult social issues through citizen involvement is greatly admired. And while it's much more difficult to do this across 27 countries at EU level, I do think there is a growing interest in finding a way to involve citizens. And that's probably the thing that I would most look back on and wish we had done more. As Anne says, you're so involved with the day-to-day stuff. We had the Euro crisis and all the rest of it in my time. But still, I think in the end, you have to not just take care of the details, but also keep an eye on the big picture things that are happening. And I do think the European institutions should be more forthright about selling the benefits and not just being a punch bag.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And Emily, can I ask you for in your current role, what are your key ambitions or objectives in the period ahead?
Well, my work is very much around what Catherine has talked about, sort of trying to bring the EU administration closer to the citizens and doing that in a way that enhances, as I say, the democratic legitimacy of the EU. Because if people don't know how decisions are being made, who's making them, who's influencing them, then vacuums emerge, and into those vacuums you get false information and false facts and lies and all of the stuff that we witnessed through Brexit. And obviously I want to enhance that and improve it. But I think I understand what Catherine was saying about the regret that it didn't communicate more with the UK people during Brexit or even coming up to Brexit. But I think in a way, I mean, it was out of respect, and it was out of a respect for the right of the British people to make their decision and all of that. But it shows that the EU administration, as I described it earlier, as I see them as the good guys, and they were acting like the good guys, respectful, mindful, careful, and all of that. But they were never going to compete with the Johnson trickery and the Dominic Cummings stuff and all of that. And if they had been able to compete with it, well, I'm not sure that would have necessarily been a good thing, because what would that have turned them into? But anyway, we are where we are, as they say. In relation to, my work, I mean, as I said, I think I have made the office what I said I hope to do at the beginning: more visible, more impactful, more relevant. I have another 2.5, 3 years to go before a successor is elected by the European Parliament. And I would like to embed whatever good I have done, and we have done, my colleagues have done, so that it's not seen as sort of experimental maverick period of European ombudsmanship, but that there is something in it which will carry on and continue to do good.
Thank you very much. As I said, we've got questions coming in, and I'm conscious that I'll try and get through a few of them while we have time. And one that's coming up that seems to be a popular question, and you all touched on it, I think, was the issue of imposter syndrome. And that question is, why is it that only women and the good ones suffer from imposter syndrome? Maybe very briefly, Anne, do you want to touch on that?
I think it's absolutely ingrained in us. I don't think it's DNA like all these things. I think it's nurture, and that we have been through schooling, we have been exposed to those societal attitudes, we internalize these feelings, and it is astonishing sometimes when you have frank, open conversations, either with brilliant women, the kind of women Emily has talked about, already making waves in their career, or even, and this has astonished me even more, when I have talked, particularly during my UN years, to women, stellar women at the most senior positions in the United Nations. And if you've been out for a cup of coffee or a drink and you get into a really confidential exchange, that either they describe it as that or they describe feelings that reflect that. So it is extraordinarily how deeply it is ingrained in us. And again, it's just a question of making yourself face up to it, the mentoring, the networking, the talking with your peers, all of that is going to help. But it's unquestionably and there to a degree that is astonishing, because it is counterfactual and counter to everything we know about the achievements and the potential of these often very brilliant women.
Thanks, Anne. Emily, would you like to add anything there?
Oh, I absolutely agree 100% with Anne. It's nurture. I think we're all bred to be good, polite little girls, you know, and it somehow remains within us. I remember briefly in 2013 when I was running for election for European Ombudsman, because it's the Parliament that decides, nobody else. So you have to be a candidate for several months, which is, despite appearances, I'm actually quite shy, and having to go and ask all of these people for their votes and talk about myself was very, very difficult. So I remember at one point I was meeting an MEP, very nice man, and he was asking me, what are you proudest of in your career? And I said, well, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. And then I stopped and I said, well, actually, I'm not really comfortable talking about myself like this. And he said, well, Emily, if you want to win, you'll have to get comfortable. And he was right. I'm not saying I changed overnight, but he was absolutely right. I couldn't hide behind this kind of whatever thing had been developed within me, or that was the result of the nurturing I had got as a woman in Ireland, or just a woman of the world. And I think women have to consciously sort of battle against it. I think that the greatest obstacle is actually your own self. And I think that the one person that can really enable you to ascend and to do whatever it is you want to do with your life is yourself, and you have to be your own biggest piece of work.
Thanks, Emily. Can I turn to you, Catherine?
Well, I would agree, obviously, with everything that's been said. Maybe I would add, though, that I think you have to play the game to a certain extent, but also I don't think women should just try to replicate, the way men operate. I think women can also bring different skills and different approaches. Anne referred earlier to Angela Merkel. Now, I know if you have the German economy behind you and you're leading the biggest member state, that obviously gives you something that the rest of us don't have. But just watching her operate in the European Council, it was completely different from the way all of the male prime ministers operated. I mean, she was always open. She always extended the hand of friendship. She was always the best prepared by a mile. And so she, played a hugely influential role, but on her terms. And it was quite a masterclass watching, because she became Chancellor just around the time I became Secretary General. So, I mean, over the 10 years that I was watching, you could see just how much she grew in stature and influence and all the rest. But at the very beginning, there was a real tendency of the men to want to patronize her and not treat her as they would have treated a male Chancellor of Germany. And she never referred to it, but she just, in her own quiet way, made sure that they understood that, she was going to do things on her terms. So I think I've said at the beginning, it's a question of all of us building confidence in the women who are following us, but also maybe, also changing the system at the same time. I think the two have to go together.
Thank you all. I think we have time for just one very quick final question. That's maybe we could turn to it very briefly, is the issue of male resentment at positive discrimination, and any ideas about how we can manage that. Maybe Emily, do you want to go first?
Male resentment and positive discrimination. Yeah, it's not something that I'm terribly exercised about at the moment, though. I'm conscious that it is there. So sometimes when men talk about this, or the issue has been discussed, I sort of say flippantly, well, welcome to our world, But I think, any good organization, any good administration works on balance, and all of the different attributes, different genders, different geographical locations, different backgrounds, they're all needed, and especially within the EU administration. So I think while it is wonderful to see more and more women getting into senior posts or even being employed in the first place, I think we always have to be conscious of balance.
Oh my God. Sorry, I clicked the wrong button there. Catherine, would you like to come in on that one, please?
I do think it's something we have to take into account. It's historically obvious that any time a position of privilege is threatened, people don't respond. Those whose privilege is under threat don't respond very well. But I think we have to work hard at explaining why gender balance is important, and that it's not about taking something away from anybody. I think living in with a better balance would have a positive effect on men as well as women. And this was something that came up quite a lot in the Citizens' Assembly, because we were discussing, for example, gender quotas. And at the beginning, there was quite a lot of resistance. But in the end, when both the men who weren't very keen on it and the women who weren't convinced just looked at how long it was taking to change unless you had some affirmative action. And I think also all of them who had, mostly in the case of the men who had daughters and were thinking about them making their way in the world, they did come to see that you had to sort of level the playing field in order to live in the kind of society we all want to live in, which is where your gender doesn't matter and you're taken on yourself and your ability rather than your gender. So I think it would be foolish of women to kind of just brush it aside. I think we have to acknowledge it's there, but not to allow it to be an obstacle. I think we have to bring men with us. And I did notice in the last years of my time in the Commission that quite a lot of younger men wanted a lot of the same kind of things, more time with their families, a life outside the office. Now, again, the pandemic has kind of fast forwarded a lot of that. And I hope that we will collectively as a society find a way of not going back to the past, but finding something that's more balanced. And I do think it will take men and women working together, because they all want to live in a more gender balanced society for everybody's sake, that I think we will finally get there. But I do think we need to take male resentment into account.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Anne, we'll give you the last word on this point.
Well, I kind of veer between understanding and impatience on this. On my understanding side, I very much agree with what's been said, that it's about having people understand that a world that is fairer to women is fairer to everyone, that ultimately we all have a stake in this, that you have to build understanding and support for the whole diversity and inclusion agenda, build it across the board, involving men as well as women. I say that quite clearly. On the other hand, there is that element of impatience that I feel about it as well. And I'm here in the US now and talk to you from New York. And, listening to all this very current discussion around President Biden's impending appointment to the Supreme Court, and he's indicated that he's going to nominate a Black woman, well-qualified Black woman, to the Supreme Court. And the amount of blowback against this, it is so blind to the privilege that white men have had for generations in gliding into positions on the Supreme Court. So, as I say, I have that bit of ambivalence about it. Yes, understanding, building support, understanding that there are many men that want to be part of this effort. So you really try to work on that. But at a certain point, if the resentment is too ill-grounded and too assertively expressed, enough is enough. Move over. It's time for us all to move on.
Thanks very much, Anne. Thank you. And look, I think this has been a really fascinating discussion, and there are a lot of questions coming in from our virtual audience today. But unfortunately, we really are we're gone a bit over our time, so I think we need to bring the webinar to a close. But I do want to once again thank our three speakers, Anne Anderson, Catherine Day, and Emily O'Reilly. And it really has been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to speak with you today and to hear all your thoughts on these issues. And I'm sure that your individual contributions to European and to public life will continue to inspire generations of women and men following you. And I'd also like to thank our online audience for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I have. If you'd like to rewatch some of the webinar or to share it with someone that you know, it will be available shortly on the Department of Foreign Affairs YouTube account. So thank you again for joining us today.